Ever since I started my YouTube channel, the Leica Q2 has been the camera I talked about the most. But ever since I got the Nikon ZF, it's easily become my most used camera of the year and one of my favorite cameras I ever used. So over the last 9 months that I've owned this camera, I've gotten to know it pretty well. So today I just want to talk about all the custom buttons, the way I use them, the way I customized this camera, as well as the picture profile I customized a little bit to give me the most pleasing out of camera colors, even if I am shooting raw, but if I want to get some like nice JPEGs as well. So this camera doesn't have a ton of custom buttons, so the ones that I do have, I try to make the most out of them. Like this specific button here in the front, I have that set up to ISO, and you do have an ISO dial here in the front, and if you're not familiar with Nikon, it's a little bit harder to go from automatic ISO back to your manual ISO. So that's how I have that set up. I have it set up so when I press the button, now suddenly these wheels, the front wheel, I can enable my auto ISO, and if I press it again, it goes back to manual ISO, which I can change with the dial back here. And so for me, who likes to use this camera for my kid and I go indoors, outdoors a lot, it is important to me that I can switch ISO back and forth very quickly. So that's why I have the front button mapped to that. And the way you go about customizing it is you go to menu and then you go down to the pencil menu and then go down to F to controls. And then you can customize controls for playback and shooting, this for shooting, and this is where you get all your custom buttons. Like I said, my front button is set to ISO so I can move it very quickly from auto to manual. So you get a bunch of different options. For me, I find out that it's the most intuitive for the way I shoot, because the way that this camera is set up, or the way that I hold my camera, is if I'm shooting, I can quickly press the button and then activate auto ISO here with the front dial. And then if I want to go back to manual ISO, I can use this back dial to switch my ISO. And that's, basically for like fast-paced scenarios. For me, honestly, if I'm shooting up by myself and I'm out with my wife on a date night or something, I usually like to set my own ISO. It's not really a problem, but in fast-paced situations, especially with kids, and for me as a dad, it's really important for me to be able to get photos of my kid very, very fast without having to fiddle with a bunch of stuff. So having the top dials are very useful. I use them quite a bit, but if I want to have a little more control with my ISO, it's important for me to be able to set it somewhere else. Speaking of ISO, I do like to customize the parameters that auto ISO works. So if you go down to the photo shooting menu and you go down to ISO sensitivity options, and so my parameters for auto ISO, I find that a lot of modern cameras have pretty good ISO performance. So it's not something that I'm like deathly afraid of to just shoot in high ISOs. So to me, I have it set to a minimum shutter speed to 1/80th of a second, especially because the vibration reduction works pretty well here, but I don't want to really chance it. So 1/80th is usually fine for me. The maximum sensitivity with flash, it's at 800. I don't use a whole bunch of flash with this, so this is just set to that. Maximum sensitivity for ISO, I have it set to 12,800. That's what I have it set to my Sony camera, so that's kind of what I gravitate towards this, just to kind of give it that consistency. But this camera is fine in high ISOs. You're gonna get a bunch of noise in there, but it's nothing like Lightroom denoise can't fix. So it's not something that I'm like super afraid of getting like tons of noise in my images. But I do like to have some parameters to help the use of auto ISO work the best. So that's basically what I have ISO settings set to in the Nikon ZF. The other button I customized is this movie record button. I remapped it to white balance because I find that it's a lot more useful that way. So I have it so where I click on it, I can go to a different white balance. And I'm pretty new to Nikon, and the auto white balance works pretty well in most situations. So I don't find myself fiddling with it a lot if I'm in a fast-paced situation. But I do like to have the option to be able to switch it if I want to. So there's a bunch of different options. You can set your custom white balance, and with both dials you can switch it out pretty easily. What I do like about Nikon is that you get a bunch of different options for automatic white balance. Like if you set to the first one, then you get a couple options to keep the overall atmosphere, keep warm light colors, and there's another one where it's mostly natural light. I find these super useful. They're pretty accurate, and so if I'm out in a fast-paced situation, I don't mind having this in auto, but I do like to have some customization as well. The other custom button that I have on this camera is this button right here, which I set to my metering, more specifically to meter for the highlights. So for me, it is very important and very useful for cameras to have that option. The Leica Q2 has it. I love it in that camera. This one has it as well. And I like that with the press of a button, it goes from metering for the overall scene just to the highlights, which is basically the way I meter most of my scenes. It's either for the overall image, or if I'm just really trying to preserve those highlights, those are the two options that I have. So it's super useful to have one right here. I do want to go over my information menu that I customized. I didn't customize it a whole bunch, but I do find that a couple things that I put on there are very useful if you're trying to stay off of the menu as much as possible. So for me, who goes indoor and outdoor quite a bit, I put the monitor and viewfinder brightness right here just so I can change it very quickly, because I don't like to have my monitor super bright if I don't have to. So usually I keep it around +4, but if I'm in a bright situation, I do like to be able to switch it off very quickly. The other option is my focusing modes. I don't really get rid of a lot of these things because I do like to switch off quite a bit. 3D tracking works pretty well, and most of the time when I'm shooting out with my kid, I just have it in this last one pretty much at all times, along with automatic subject detect. Works pretty well. I find that I don't really miss a whole bunch of stuff, especially if I'm using native glass. I think it's comparable to Sony. I've been with Sony for a long time, so I really trust the autofocus, and I find that I trust the autofocus in Nikon just as well. So having this right here is really useful. The focus mode at the end, I do like to have it here as well because I do like to use manual focus lenses on this camera. So I do like to go from manual focus to continuous autofocus quite a bit. With this camera, I don't tend to shoot in single autofocus much. It's mostly on continuous autofocus pretty much at all times. Again, it's because the autofocus is so good, and the way I customize my shooting experience is mostly with the autofocus area, which you get a bunch of different controls for. For me, I usually stay in wide single if I'm like not shooting for my kid. If I'm taking photos out and about with my wife, this is the one I stay with the most. And having a touchscreen with the Nikon ZF is really useful, but not having like a joystick, it's not something that really bothers me because I'm not used to them, my like fun cameras to have them. So it's not something I miss, but there's a bunch of different options to be able to move your focus point around. Vibration reduction is also on here. It's mostly on at all times, especially because it is very useful if you're shooting with slower glass, which I do quite a bit, to be honest, because this is one of my favorite lenses, the 28mm f2.8. So once the sun gets down, it's a lot harder to shoot fast-moving subjects, but having vibration reduction really helps out because you can shoot with at like 1/10 of a second, get pretty nice results. Like I said, I do like to use manual focus lenses on this camera quite a bit, so I do use focus peaking quite a bit. So the way I have that set up is if you go to your main menu, you go to the pencil, you go to focus, and then you go to A12, you can customize your focus peaking, which to me I have it on and peaking on set to low. I find that it works pretty well, to be honest. That's what I have it set to. It works fine with me. The color I have it set to is red. I find that to me it's the most less distracting while still being able to focus on it, because all the other colors, I feel like they're too subtle for the way I like to shoot. So red is basically what I have it set to. The cool thing about manually focusing with Nikon cameras is that you can move your focus point around even if you're shooting manual focus, and then when you punch in, it'll go to that direct spot, and if you punch in further, it'll still go right to the spot that you picked, which is super useful if you're trying to get critical focus in a different part of the frame that's not the center. So that's something that I use quite a bit if I'm shooting with one of my manually focused lenses. I don't use a lot of like the fancier adapters that you get more with the contacts that they have. So I use a lot of dummy adapters. They work perfectly fine. And that's basically just the only thing I do for manually focusing in on this camera. And lastly, what I want to talk about is the picture profile that I use for this camera. And it's called Creative Controls on Nikon. So I use rich tone portrait, and I find that that's the most pleasing JPEGs to my eye. So I like the fact that you get really nice JPEGs, even if I am shooting RAW plus JPEG. So I can give these pictures to my family, to my wife, anybody that doesn't really like to have like a lot of editing done to the photos, or for me who just wants to give someone a photo really quickly. So if you're familiar with Nikon, you know that you don't get a ton of customization with picture profiles here, but the only thing I did was go to rich tone portrait and adjust it, and then only a couple of little things. I reduced the sharpening to -1, the mid-range sharpening to -1, clarity is set to 0, contrast is set to 0, brightness 0, saturation 0, and then the hue to -1. So I wish there was more customization that I could do to these profiles, like a tonal curve or anything like that. I know you can do it with software, but when you do that, it just feels like it's a ton more work. I wish we could do it in camera. And to be honest, with this specific profile, the only thing I would do to it is just add maybe some grain in camera, and that will be about it. The only other profile that I use is just, you know, if you're familiar with this camera, you know that it has a dedicated black and white button here, or black and white dial. And so you can go right into black and white just from the flick of a switch here. And the one I use for that is just monochrome. I don't really use any custom profile for that. It's just the monochrome, the standard monochrome profile, and you're good to go. The monochrome files out of this camera, and I've said it before, I find that they're just as nice as the Leica monochrome files that I like on my Q2. So I find that those two profiles work really well, especially if you're getting this camera, you don't want to do a ton to it. You just want, maybe you're drawn to the custom dials and like the retro design of it, and you don't want to mess with like colors with RAWs and everything. So I find that to be more than enough, and it's something that I use quite a bit with my camera. So this guide wasn't super in depth, but I hope that the way that I customized my camera gave people some idea on how they can customize the Nikon ZF. And so if you have any questions on anything Nikon ZF related or anything else, please leave them in the comment section below. I'll try to get back to you, because it is a camera that I really love talking about, and it's a camera I've used for so long that it's just like my Leica Q2, that I feel like the Nikon ZF is one of those cameras that's going to stay in the kit no matter what. Everything else comes and goes, especially in the professional setting. I'm always looking for the thing that will make my job faster. But the Nikon ZF is one of those perfect blends of both function and like how fun it is to use. So I don't plan on ever selling this. So yeah, if you have any questions on the Nikon ZF, on how to use it or anything else, please leave me in the comment section below. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, if you would like to see more videos like this, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.